U.S. President Donald Trump has said he and Russian President Vladimir Putin made great progress in a phone call on Thursday. He added that they'd agreed to meet in Budapest, though provided no date. Trump wrote on Truth Social that the meeting in Hungary would be to end the, quote, inglorious war between Russia and Ukraine. His phone call with the Russian leader comes a day before he is due to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Washington.
I'd like to thank you very much.
And let's go straight to our correspondent in D.C., Misha Komodowski. Misha, what more do we know about that phone call?
Well, as we know, all week, a high-level Ukrainian delegation has been here in Washington, D.C. Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko, Presidential Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak, and now President Zelensky himself, who just landed in Washington, D.C. But my sources tell me that the Ukrainians were not told in advance about Trump's surprise announcement of this very Budapest summit. As we know, as soon as President Trump moved closer to boosting U.S. support for Ukraine, Vladimir Putin stepped in, proposing a new summit with Trump, even as Russian strikes kept hitting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. Right now, it doesn't look like the Kremlin is ready for the trilateral meeting Trump wants, the one Zelensky is open to, but Putin clearly is not. And Trump himself has said that Putin doesn't want to end this war anytime soon. And according to the president, he and Putin agreed to meet in Budapest, though there is still no date. Their teams, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, are set to meet next week. But again, the location is unclear.
The location is clear. It's Budapest. It's the date that is unclear. But why Budapest?
Well, Hungary, under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, represents a politically convenient and legally safe venue for Russia's leaders. Unlike most Western nations, Hungary has taken a notably pro-Russian and pro-Trump stance in recent years, providing both diplomatic neutrality and symbolic value to the talks on the Ukraine war. And Viktor Orban has praised these efforts online, saying that they are ready for such a meeting. And Hungary, as we know, is still technically part of the International Criminal Court in 2025, which is currently prosecuting Vladimir Putin, but is in the formal process of withdrawing. So indeed, it is a safe haven for Putin.
On Friday, you mentioned it, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will come to the White House. How do you expect this phone call to affect his visit?
Well, the big question here is, what will President Zelensky take home now? My sources say that in the latest call with Trump, Zelensky asked the president to lift the ban on long-range U.S. weapon strikes inside Russia, and he hoped that this decision would be announced at their meeting. And this morning, members of the Ukrainian delegation sounded very upbeat to me, but now it's unclear whether Trump will grant that request or, for example, announce the transfer of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine before the Budapest summit. Ukrainian officials stress that striking targets deep inside Russia is not about escalation at all. They call it a humanitarian step. As it sounds like a paradox, but they argue such strikes could actually save lives by stopping Russian attacks that kill mostly civilians and destroy Ukraine's infrastructure every day.
DW Washington correspondent Misha Komodowski. Thank you so much, Misha. Fresh off the Gaza ceasefire deal, U.S. President Donald Trump now has his sights set on ending the war in Ukraine. Today, he spoke to Vladimir Putin on the phone and made what he called great progress. Tomorrow, he will welcome the Ukrainian president at the White House. Trump has openly mused about selling Tomahawk missiles to Kyiv to push Moscow to the negotiating table. In a moment, I'll speak to an analyst about the challenges in securing peace in Ukraine. But first, here's a look at the momentum and the tactics Trump might use.
First, we have to get Russia done. We got to get that one done.
There is now very strong momentum for peace in the world, following the agreements reached for the Middle East.
This afternoon, I would like to take the opportunity to talk to the American president again about what we can do together to end this war.
After 8 months in office, U.S. President Donald Trump has confidence that he can solve multiple long-lasting conflicts around the globe, and that everyone else wants to get on board. But despite claiming last year that he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, Trump has had no luck in solving it so far. Peace through strength has been Trump's motto. But over much of the past year, there's been little military strength on offer. In February, Trump humiliated Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House for allegedly being ungrateful, then briefly cut off weapons and intelligence sharing. He seemed to defer to Russian President Vladimir Putin's take on the war and placed great emphasis on a summit in Alaska in August with the Russian leader. But when that failed to yield results, Trump lost patience. He warmed to Zelensky, and his tone became much more critical of Russia. The U.S. has not publicly reached out to China and India, Russia's friends who might have been able to provide pressure, despite Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's offer to mediate. Instead, Trump started a trade war with China and slapped 50% tariffs on India as punishment for buying Russian oil. Now Trump says India will stop purchasing Russian oil and that he will urge China to do the same. Meanwhile, the war has raged on, the front line still claiming thousands of casualties a week for tiny territorial gains. Both sides hit the other with escalating drone and missile attacks. Russia hitting Ukrainian infrastructure to shut off electricity and heat, and Ukraine targeting Russian oil facilities to hit its economy where it hurts. So what can Trump do to force peace? Since giving up on diplomacy with Putin, Trump has brought up one way to make peace through strength a reality, supplying Ukraine with a weapon Russia fears, one that can strike deep inside its borders.
You might say, look, if this war's not going to get settled, I'm going to send them Tomahawks. I may say that. The Tomahawk is an incredible weapon, very offensive weapon.
Tomahawk missiles carry a 500-kilogram payload much farther than the medium-range missiles like ATACMS and Storm Shadows that Ukraine has been using. Its 2,500-kilometer range puts Moscow within striking distance, as well as the Olenia Air Base, where Russia launches many of the missiles that have been pounding Ukraine. Tomahawks are at the top of Ukraine's wish list, and the very idea that the U.S. might supply them to Ukraine has provoked Russia.
It's important to understand that we're talking about missiles that can also be nuclear capable. Therefore, this is a truly serious round of escalation.
Supplying Tomahawks would be a way to put pressure on Russia directly. Meanwhile, Trump is escalating his trade war with China. That may make compromise with the U.S.'s biggest rival even harder, and making it even more difficult to get China on his side to push Russia to end its war.
Rachel Rizzo from the Atlantic Council in Washington joins me now. Rachel, President Trump says that with the Gaza ceasefire in place, he's now turning his focus to getting Russia done. From a strategic perspective, how realistic is it for Washington and Steve Witkoff in particular to shift gears so quickly from the Middle East to brokering peace in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's important to note that Trump and his team have been trying to, quote, get Russia done since Trump entered office in January. And I think their team does deserve a lot of praise for what they were able to accomplish with the Gaza and Israel ceasefire. But I think we also have to remember that the conflict in Ukraine, Russia's war against Ukraine, is a very different kind of conflict. It's extremely in-depth, a state-on-state conflict with grievances that go back centuries. I mean, this is a very deep-rooted conflict for President Putin. And so the idea that you can just pivot from one to the other or relate the two together, I think is a little bit easier said than done. And the fact that they have not been able to make that much progress between Russia and Ukraine over the last 8 months just shows how difficult this conflict truly is and truly continues to be.
Putin has so far resisted direct talks with Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. Of course, does the breakthrough in Gaza put any pressure at all on him to force a change?
I'm a little bit bearish on this. I don't think that the outcome in the Middle East puts pressure on Putin. I mean, there's nothing about that, the outcome of that potential conflict in the Middle East that would result in Vladimir Putin sitting back and saying, well, you know what, this needs to come to an end, a ceasefire needs to be in place. Walking away in his mind with anything less than a win is a non-negotiable. And up until this point, he has shown no desire to negotiate. He's shown no desire to come to the table. On the flip side, he has continued his bombings, continued his aggression against Ukraine, against civilians in particular. And so I think that you will see from the Trump team starting to put more pressure on Putin, but the outcome in the Middle East is not what's going to translate into that pressure. It's going to be what the U.S. is willing to provide the Ukrainians going forward, and how Europe and the U.S. are going to be willing to put more pressure on Russia.
Mm-hmm. There has been a lot of talk about momentum. It sounds like you would say that that is not a factor here.
I wouldn't say it's the deciding factor, no. I mean, I think that if you're sitting in the White House at the moment and you're Trump or you're Witkoff or you're these negotiating teams, you're probably feeling pretty good about what you accomplished out of the negotiations in Egypt last week. And again, like I said, I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. And let's hope they can try to push that momentum into some sort of negotiated ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. But I don't think that Putin is going to be any more willing to come to the table because of what Trump's team was able to accomplish. They're separate conflicts. They're very different from one another. But now that one in the Middle East is at least settled for now, there's a lot of unknowns on the table. Now the team can hopefully put more focus on really putting pressure on Russia to get them to the table. So let's watch that closely over the coming weeks and see if we can get something out of that. Of course, Zelensky's coming to the White House tomorrow here in Washington, and we'll be watching that closely as well.
Exactly. And he insists that Ukraine will not negotiate from a position of weakness. He always has, and he holds on to the Ukrainian vision of a just peace. What negotiating position would you say they find themselves in right now with seemingly stronger U.S. backing, because the rhetoric towards Russia has markedly changed, but a difficult situation nonetheless on the battlefield?
It's definitely changed, at least the rhetoric from the United States. I think, looking back on that February meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office that went totally off the rails, people that watch this conflict closely watched that happening and thought to ourselves, this really does not bode well for Ukraine, and it certainly didn't. However, what we've also seen happen in the months after that meeting was Putin really tried to drag the U.S. team along, saying that they would maybe be open to negotiations, but then nothing comes of it. There was that meeting in Alaska that really went nowhere. And I think Trump and his team are feeling very frustrated. They're feeling probably humiliated in a sense. And so because of that frustration with Russia, not because of any sort of affection for Ukraine, I think Ukraine is coming into this conversation, this Zelensky-Trump conversation tomorrow, from a better negotiating position. So let's see if the discussion about sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, if that develops into something substantial. Let's talk about, whether or not the Europeans are willing to use frozen Russian bank assets as a loan to Ukraine. There's a lot in play here, but it's much better than it was back in February when Zelensky came to Washington.
How could Tomahawks change the equation? Could that pressure Putin to negotiate in earnest?
Well, I don't think the sending of Tomahawk missiles is going to be what changes the outcome of this war. It's going to have to be a pretty intense combination of military support for Ukraine, helping Ukraine build its defense industrial base, giving Ukraine money to help in its reconstruction, but also putting immense pressure on Vladimir Putin in the sense of tightening sanctions, and potentially, as I mentioned before, using his frozen Russian bank assets that are held in Euroclear, a Belgian bank, to make this potential loan for Ukraine to help its reconstruction. So So all of those taken together might put pressure on Putin. But one of those, especially the Tomahawk missiles, isn't going to be the deciding factor here. It'll be a combination of all of them.
We'll have to wrap up shortly, but I do want to ask you one thing. With the Gaza war, it was always said that there is one person on the planet who can end it, and that is Donald Trump. Would you say that that also applies to the war in Ukraine?
I don't think so. I think Vladimir Putin is very much the main player here, and he's shown over and over again an unwillingness to come to the table, even under pressure from Trump and his team. So I would say he's still the main person here that needs to be placed under pressure. And let's see if Trump and his team are willing to put the heft behind that in order to get him to the table.
Rachel Rizzo of the Atlantic Council, always great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much.